Welcome back to another case review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at Cougar's new Gemini M silver case. Now, this thing comes in around 79 Australian dollars, so that would be around 50, 60 USD. Now, what's actually special about this case is it has a bit of an RGB front panel, and it's just an interesting design. And yeah, we're going to be taking a look at how that affects airflow later in the video. There'll be timestamps in the comments and the description in case if you just want to skip straight there. Anyway, let's get the review going. Getting the case out of the box gives us a good look at the foam protecting the case. It's really nothing special, it's just cheap hard foam that would only protect the case from a few light bumps and a good drop, so it's quite possible the glass side panel won't survive a long haul. At first, it's easy to think that removing the glass is fairly simple with 4 thumb screws in the corners, but a little sticker told me that the case actually needs to be placed on its side to remove the glass. Now this is pretty simple, but it means that you might have to undo cabling at the back of the case in order to take the glass off. The other side is rather straightforward, there's just 2 thumb screws holding it on at the back. Taking that off reveals the I/O connectors in the accessories box. Opening up the box, we can find a pretty detailed manual along with 5 decently length cable ties and all the screws. The screws in question are pretty limited. There's motherboard standoffs, hexagonal power supply screws, and SSD and motherboard screws. Anyway, let's move on to the I/O. The connectors consist of one USB 2.0, one USB 3.0, an HD audio header, SATA power for the RGB strip at the front, and a daisy-chainable RGB cable to connect to your motherboard. And let's not forget the power switch and power LED connectors. Speaking of I/O related things, let's check out the front ports. They consist of one USB 3.0 port, 2 USB 2.0 ports, headphone and mic jacks, as well as a power button and an RGB switch to control the RGB modes. While we're at the top of the case, let's take a look at the included top dust filter. It's a coarse plastic mesh with magnets glued to it, but it'll do a decent enough job at keeping the dust out. Let's move around to the back of the case. Here we can see 4 non-reusable PCI covers, which is unfortunate to see at this price point, but moving up a little, there's a height adjustable 120mm fan mount. Going down to the bottom of the case, we can see that the case sits on top of full rubber padded case feet, and there's a fine power supply dust filter, which can be taken out and installed pretty easily from the back. Coming around into the case, there's 5 pre-installed motherboard standoffs, and 6 cutouts for cable management, 2 of which are at the top of the case, which means routing any cables to the top is fairly easy. Just make sure you route the top cables before installing any fans or radiators at the top, so they might get in the way. At the front there's also screw holes, which I believe are there to accommodate reservoirs. Moving to the back side of the motherboard tray, we can see 7 cable tie-down points, in frankly not very good positions for cable management, except for the ones on the right which can be used for the CPU power cable. Coming back around to the power supply basement, there's a giant cutout for power supply viewing, but to be honest I would have preferred there not to be a cutout here in case if you have something that's not so aesthetically pleasing. Speaking of cutouts though, there's a big one closer to the front to allow for a radiator and fan setup inside the case. Speaking of cooling related things, let's move on to fan and radiator support. At the back you can fit a single 120mm fan, which is currently occupied by the included fan, which is actually one of Cougar's Vortex series fans. It also uses a 3-pin motherboard connector. At the top of the case there's support for 2 120mm or 140mm fans, and at the front you can fit 3 120mm or 2 140mm fans.
As for front radiator support, there's room for a push-pull 240mm radiator at the front if you remove the RGB strip and mount one set of fans to the outside of the frame. The front also supports 280mm or 360mm radiators in a push or pull configuration. At the top, there is support for up to a 240mm radiator, again in push or pull. And at the back, you can fit a 120mm radiator. Now before we move on to the cooling results, let's talk about the front panel. It features a metallic looking plastic that is a bit of a fingerprint and dust magnet. Now down the middle there is an acrylic window to see the RGB. Now this is acrylic, so it collects a lot of dust and fingerprints too very easily. However, when you go to clean it, it scratches the absolute bejesus out of it, so be careful not to get dirt and dust on it. Next to the acrylic, we can see the main source of airflow through the front. It's just a metal mesh with unfortunately no filter, but there's also a massive gap at the bottom where air and dust can potentially enter. Okay, so speaking of airflow, let's get on to the results. First up, we have 5 runs of Cinebench R15. Looking at the graph, for some reason we can see that maxing out the case with 3 fans intaking and 3 fans exhausting yielded worse results than stock. But then taking off the front panel with the case maxed out yielded temps of 2 degrees cooler. Now all these results are within margin of error, so we can't really conclude anything from this graph. Next up is a 20-minute stress test of AIDA64. What we can gather here is a similar trend to the first graph, where maxing out the case with the front panel on can yield worse results than stock. However, when we take that front panel off, we see a drop in temps of 4 degrees, which puts it 3 degrees higher than stock. Again, we can't really conclude anything here. And for the last of the CPU results, we have a 20-minute stress test of Prime 95. From the graph again, we can see that maxing out the case with the front panel on yields the worst result. However, maxing it out with no front panel only sees a 3 degree difference between the best case scenario, which is open air, meaning that this case is probably better off in a negative pressure situation without any front fans. Now for the GPU results. Here we have a 20-minute stress test of Unigine superposition. Here we can see that at stock the case fared the worst at 64 degrees over ambient, where maxing out the case with the front panel on got the best results at only 54 degrees over ambient. And taking the front panel off made the temps rise 1 degree, which is well within the margin of error. Now comparing the Gemini M's stock average over all the tests shows that it's not too bad of a case for airflow, especially for the CPU results being on par with the open air result. Now this is pretty surprising considering the limited ventilation at the front. Anyway, from all these results, we can conclude that having the case in a negative pressure setup with 3 fans exhausting and no front fan is the best for CPU air-cooled results, and maxing out the case yields the best for GPU results. So, with the thermals out of the way, let's talk about the drive support. The most obvious drive mounts here are the 3 spots on top of the power supply basement and 1 behind the motherboard. Only 2 cages are included though, meaning that there's only support for 2 2.5 inch drives, or 4 if you occupy the removable drive cage with 2 as well. Speaking of the drive cage, there's also support for 2 3.5 inch drives here. Now, let's move on to cable management. Overall, the cable management in this thing was relatively simple and easy. Most of the cable clutter went into the basement, and I ended up just using the screw holes on the left side as cable tie-down points for the motherboard and front I/O cables. There was also a cutout for routing the graphics card cable through the top of the power supply basement for a cleaner look. Next up is clearance. The case officially supports graphics cards up to 33cm long and CPU coolers up to 175mm tall, which means you can fit a Noctua NHD 14 or 15 for example. As for power supply clearance, you can fit power supplies up to about 27mm long, but you would also have to move the drive cage to the left a little, which would impact your front radiator and fan clearance. But if you needed both and you're going for an SSD only system, you could remove the drive cage entirely. In the far right position, the max power supply length is about 160 to 170 millimeters long. So, wrapping up this review, this case is overall a great case, both in terms of airflow and cable management. However, the use of that acrylic on the front really does get me.
I hate acrylic side windows there. I just want to see them burn.
But if you don't mind it, I would recommend this case as a micro ATX alternative to something like an NZXT H500 or even Deepcool's Matrix 50. So that does it for this review. If you liked it, you know what button to hit, and if you didn't like it, I'd love to hear some constructive criticism in the comments below. And if you want to see more case reviews or other tech reviews, you might want to consider subscribing.